They say some houses don't forget the people they've lost, and Blackwood Manor had been holding its breath for 5 long years when the storm finally came to break it, as rain lashed against the tall windows in relentless waves and wind howled through the iron gates like a warning no one dared to hear. Yet inside the vast stone halls everything remained still, suffocatingly quiet, as if even time itself refused to move. And at the center of it stood Duke Nathaniel Crowhurst, motionless before a dying fire, his shadow stretching across the cold marble floor like a man already buried, his steel-gray eyes fixed on nothing, feeling nothing, because whatever heart he once had been buried with his wife on a night no one in this house ever spoke of, not the servants who walked softly and avoided his gaze, not the groundskeeper who let the once proud gardens fall into quiet ruin, and certainly not the small girl who lived behind closed doors at the end of the East Wing, a child who had not spoken a single word since that same night, as if silence had become the only language left in this house. And so when the front doors suddenly burst open under the force of the storm, and a young woman stumbled inside, drenched from head to toe, clutching a worn leather case to her chest as though it held everything she owned, the servants froze, exchanging uncertain glances because no one arrived at Blackwood Manor unannounced, and no one ever stayed. Yet she stood there trembling but upright, her eyes lifting just once to take in the towering ceilings, the flickering candlelight, the weight of something unseen pressing against the air, and she did not turn to leave, did not ask permission, did not apologize for the intrusion. She simply remained, as if the storm outside had delivered her not by accident but by design, and somewhere down the corridor a faint sound echoed, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't. It was the quiet step of a child who had long forgotten how to run, and as little Lily Crowhurst appeared at the top of the staircase, her pale fingers gripping the banister, her wide, watchful eyes fixed on the stranger below, something shifted in the air, something fragile and dangerous, because for the first time in years the girl moved forward on her own, step by careful step, descending into the great hall where no laughter had lived in half a decade. And when she reached the bottom, when she stood just inches from the soaked and shivering governess, she hesitated only for a breath before lifting her small hand and wrapping her fingers around the woman's sleeve, holding on as though she had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. And then, in a voice so faint it barely seemed real, she spoke, a single word that broke the silence like glass: "Stay." And across the hall, unseen in the shadows above, the Duke felt something inside his chest fracture, not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet, terrifying certainty, because whatever had just begun in that moment, he knew with absolute clarity that it would not end the way the last story in this house had ended, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. The word lingered in the air long after it was spoken, fragile and impossible, as if the walls themselves did not know how to carry it, and for a moment no one moved, not the servants standing frozen near the door, not the young woman whose sleeve was still held by small trembling fingers, and certainly not the man watching from the shadows above, because Nathaniel Crowhurst had heard many things in his life, commands, lies, condolences whispered with hollow sympathy, but he had not heard his daughter speak in 5 years, not since the night everything inside this house had gone silent. And now a single word had undone that silence as though it had never existed. His breath caught without permission, his hand tightening slightly against the cold railing as he stepped forward just enough for the candlelight to reveal his presence, tall, still, and distant as ever, his gaze falling first on the child, and then slowly shifting to the stranger who had somehow crossed a line no one else had been able to reach. And she did not flinch under that gaze, did not lower her eyes like the others always did. She simply stood there, soaked from the storm, her hair damp against her cheeks, her expression calm, in a way that did not ask for approval or forgiveness, as if she had already accepted whatever judgment might come, and that unsettled him more than defiance ever could, because there was no fear in her posture, only a quiet steadiness that did not belong in this house. "Who are you?" he asked at last, his voice low, controlled, carrying through the hall with the weight of authority that had never once been questioned, and the servants seemed to hold their breath as though the answer might change something they had long accepted. The young woman gently loosened her sleeve from the child's grasp, but did not step away entirely. "My name is Elena Hayes, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but clear, each word placed carefully without trembling. "I was sent here as the new governess." A flicker of something passed through his expression, brief and unreadable, because there had been others before her, many, each one leaving within days, some quietly, some in tears, none ever making it past the invisible barrier that surrounded his daughter. And yet here she stood on her first night with the child still holding onto the edge of her coat, as if letting go would mean losing something important. "No one informed me of your arrival," he said, though the words carried less accusation than they should have, more observation than anger, and still she did not retreat. "The storm delayed the carriage that was meant to accompany me, Your Grace," she replied. "I arrived the only way I could." The honesty of it hung between them, simple and unembellished, and for a moment he considered dismissing her immediately, sending her back into the night where she had come from, restoring the balance this house had maintained for years. But his eyes shifted once more to the small hand still clutching her coat, and something inside him hesitated, not out of kindness, not even curiosity, but something far more unsettling, recognition, as though the silence that had defined his life had been challenged without warning. "You may stay the night," he said finally, the words measured, deliberate, as if granting nothing more than temporary shelter. "We will discuss your position in the morning." It was not an invitation, not acceptance, merely a delay, but it was more than anyone had expected, and as the servants hurried to prepare a room, casting cautious glances toward the girl who had not yet released her grip, Nathaniel turned away, already retreating into the shadows that had long been his refuge. Yet even as he walked, he could feel it, that single word echoing behind him, not fading, not disappearing, but settling into the silence he had once believed could never be broken. Morning did not arrive gently at Blackwood Manor. It never did. Instead, it crept in through narrow windows and settled like a pale ghost over cold stone and silent corridors. And when Elena Hayes opened her eyes in the unfamiliar room she had been given, she did not move at once, as if she understood instinctively that this house demanded stillness before anything else. The fire in the hearth had long since burned low, leaving only faint warmth in the air, and beyond the door she could hear nothing, not footsteps, not voices, not even the distant clatter of morning routines that belonged to ordinary homes, because this place did not wake, it endured. And yet she rose without hesitation, smoothing her simple dress, her fingers steady despite the weight of everything she had stepped into the night before, as if leaving had never truly been an option. When she stepped into the corridor, the silence pressed closer, watching her, testing her, but she walked forward anyway, following the faint memory of the path she had been led through, until she reached the east wing where the light seemed thinner, colder, and there, seated by the tall window with a doll resting quietly in her lap, was Lily Crowhurst, exactly where she had been left, exactly as she had been found, as though the hours between had not existed at all. The child did not turn immediately, did not acknowledge her presence, but Elena did not speak, did not announce herself. She simply crossed the room and sat a few feet away, leaving space, offering nothing but her presence. And time passed, not measured in minutes, but in breaths, in the quiet rhythm of a house that had forgotten how to change, until at last Lily's small fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of her dress, and she shifted just enough to glance toward the woman who had not left, and something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. Downstairs, Nathaniel stood in the study, a letter unopened on his desk, his attention nowhere near the words that awaited him, because despite himself his thoughts had returned again and again to the same moment, to the same voice that had broken through 5 years of silence. He had told himself it meant nothing, that children spoke sometimes, that it would pass, that the girl would retreat again into the quiet that had defined her. But something in him resisted that explanation, something sharper, more dangerous, because he had seen the way she had held on to the governess, not out of fear, but out of something else entirely, something he could not name. When a soft knock sounded at the door, he did not respond at first, but it came again, hesitant but persistent. "Enter," he said at last, his tone as controlled as ever, and when the door opened it was not a servant who stepped inside, but Elena Hayes, her posture composed, her expression unchanged, as though she had not spent the night under the roof of a man known for sending people away without a second thought. "Your Grace," she said quietly, stopping just inside the room. And for a moment he said nothing, simply studying her with that same unreadable gaze, as if searching for something that would justify removing her from this house before whatever had begun could take root. "You were told we would discuss your position this morning," he said finally, his voice cool, measured. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, and again there was no fear, no urgency, only that same quiet steadiness that unsettled him more than resistance ever could. "Then I will make this clear," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This house is not like others. You will find no comfort here, no companionship, and no reason to remain longer than necessary." A pause, deliberate, final. Most do not last a week. The warning hung in the air between them, sharp and intentional, but she did not look away, did not step back. She simply met his gaze with calm certainty and answered in a voice that did not rise, did not waver. "I am not most people, Your Grace." And for the briefest moment, something shifted again in the silence of that room, something small, almost imperceptible, but enough that Nathaniel Crowhurst felt it, the faintest crack in the certainty he had built his life upon. And he did not yet understand why that unsettled him more than anything else ever had. The words lingered between them long after she had spoken them, simple and unadorned, yet carrying a weight that did not belong to someone standing in a house that had driven stronger souls away. And Nathaniel Crowhurst found himself watching her longer than necessary, as though expecting the certainty in her voice to falter under his gaze. But it did not. It remained steady, unchanged, and that unsettled him in ways he did not care to examine. "Confidence does not change reality," he said at last, turning slightly as if to dismiss the moment entirely. Yet something in his tone lacked the finality it once held. "No, Your Grace," she replied quietly, "but it allows someone to endure it." And there it was again, that quiet persistence that did not challenge him, did not provoke him, yet refused to retreat, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he did not send her away. Instead, he gestured toward the door with a slight motion of his hand. "You will begin your duties today," he said, each word measured, controlled. "The child's routine has not changed in years. You will follow it exactly." A pause, deliberate. "Do not expect progress." It was not instruction, it was warning, and still she inclined her head in acknowledgement without argument, without hesitation, and left the room as silently as she had entered, leaving behind a stillness that felt somehow altered, as though the air itself had shifted in her absence. Nathaniel remained where he stood for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the closed door, his thoughts uncharacteristically unsettled, before he forced them aside with practiced ease, turning back to the papers on his desk that demanded his attention. Yet even as he read, the words blurred, meaningless against the quiet echo of something he could not ignore. Upstairs, Elena returned to the east wing where Lily sat once more by the window. The same position, the same silence, yet not entirely the same, because when Elena entered this time, the child's gaze lifted almost immediately, not startled, not uncertain, simply aware, and Elena moved as she had before, without haste, without expectation, taking her place a few feet away, allowing the space between them to exist without pressure. Minutes passed, perhaps longer, until she reached into the small case she had carried through the storm and withdrew a simple book, its edges worn, its cover softened by years of use. She did not offer it, did not hold it out. She simply opened it and began to read, her voice soft, steady, filling the room without disturbing it. The words were simple, gentle, but they carried warmth that did not belong to this house. And for a while nothing changed. Lily remained still, her fingers resting lightly on the doll in her lap, her expression unreadable. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she shifted closer, not enough to be obvious, just enough that the distance between them no longer felt quite so vast, and Elena continued reading as if she had not noticed, as if the moment did not need acknowledgement to be real. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel found himself walking past the east wing without intention, his steps slowing despite himself as a faint sound reached him. Not silence, Not the hollow quiet he had grown accustomed to, but something else, a voice, low and calm, carrying through the partially open door, and beneath it, softer still, the subtle movement of someone listening. He stopped without realizing it, standing just outside, unseen, as the unfamiliar rhythm of spoken words filled a space that had been untouched for years, and though he did not step inside, did not reveal his presence, he remained there longer than he should have, his expression unreadable, his thoughts unguarded for the briefest of moments, because somewhere within that quiet sound, something long dormant stirred, not hope, not yet, but something dangerously close to it, and for a man who had spent years ensuring he felt nothing at all, that was the most unsettling change of all. The sound of her voice should have faded once he walked away. It should have dissolved into the same emptiness that consumed every other noise in this house. Yet it followed him, quiet but persistent, threading through the long corridors and settling somewhere he had long ago sealed shut. And Nathaniel Crowhurst did not appreciate things that lingered, especially not things he could not control. So by the next morning he told himself it had meant nothing, that the child would return to silence, that the governess would prove no different than the others. And yet when he passed the east wing again, slower this time, more deliberate, he found the door slightly ajar and the same low voice within, steady, patient, unchanged, and he stopped, not because he intended to listen, but because something in him resisted walking away. Inside the room, Elena sat near the window once more, the pale light outlining her figure as she read from the same worn book, her voice even, unhurried, as though she had nowhere else to be. And Lily sat closer now, not touching, but no longer distant, her small hands resting quietly in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the book, but on the woman reading it, as if the words themselves mattered less than the presence behind them. And when Elena turned a page, Lily's fingers moved slightly, mimicking the motion, subtle and uncertain, but real, and Nathaniel saw it, every small detail of it, the shift, the attention, the fragile thread forming between them. And something inside him tightened in response, not with anger, not exactly, but with something sharper, something that felt dangerously like disruption, because this house had rules, unspoken but absolute. Nothing changed here, nothing healed, nothing returned once it was lost, and yet he was watching it happen in the smallest of ways, and it unsettled him more than any raised voice or defiance ever could. He pushed the door open without warning, the sound cutting cleanly through the quiet, and Elena stopped reading at once, lifting her gaze toward him, calm as ever, while Lily did not retreat as she once would have, did not turn away or hide. She simply remained where she was, her eyes flickering briefly toward him before returning to Elena, and that alone was enough to shift something in the air. "You will not fill this house with distractions," Nathaniel said, his tone controlled but edged, as though he were correcting something that had gone too far, and Elena closed the book gently, placing it beside her without haste. "It is not a distraction, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "It is a beginning." The word lingered, unwelcome, unfamiliar, and his gaze sharpened slightly. "There is no beginning here," he said, each word precise, final. "There is only what remains." And for a moment the silence stretched between them again, heavier now, more charged, but she did not look away, did not lower her voice. "Then perhaps what remains is not as empty as you believe," she said. And it was not defiance, not challenge, just truth spoken without fear, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because he did not know how to argue with something that did not try to fight him. His eyes shifted then, almost against his will, to the child who sat watching them both, silent as ever, yet different, undeniably different. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel Crowhurst found himself uncertain not of what had been lost, but of what might still be waiting beneath the silence he had accepted as permanent, and that uncertainty lingered long after he turned away, leaving the room colder than before, yet not quite as empty. That night the house seemed quieter than usual, not because there was less sound, but because something unspoken had shifted beneath it, like a breath held too long finally beginning to tremble, and Nathaniel Crowhurst felt it the moment he stepped into the long corridor outside his study. The air no longer entirely empty, no longer entirely still, and he did not like it, did not trust it. Because silence had always been something he controlled, something he understood, but this was different. This was something he could not predict, and that alone made it dangerous. He moved through the dimly lit halls with measured steps, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows that stretched and shifted as if the walls themselves were watching. And when he passed the east wing again, he did not intend to stop, yet his steps slowed regardless, drawn by something quieter than before, not the sound of reading this time, but something softer, almost imperceptible. He turned slightly, just enough to see through the narrow opening of the door. And inside the room Elena sat near the small bed, her voice lowered to a gentle murmur. Not reading now, but speaking in a way that required no response, as if she understood that some silences were not meant to be broken all at once. And Lily lay beneath the covers, her small frame still, her eyes open but calm, watching, listening, present in a way Nathaniel had not seen in years. And then it happened, so quietly it might have been missed entirely. Lily's fingers shifted against the blanket, reaching outward, not hesitating, not uncertain, until they brushed lightly against Elena's hand, and she did not pull away, did not react with surprise. She simply turned her hand slightly, so the child could hold it if she wished, and Lily did, her small fingers wrapping around Elena's with a quiet certainty that did not ask permission, and Nathaniel felt something inside him tighten again, not sharp this time, not disruptive, but deeper, heavier, as if something long buried had been disturbed in a way he could not undo. He stepped back, without thinking, retreating from the doorway as though the moment itself was something private, something he had no right to witness, and yet it followed him. That simple, silent gesture, more powerful than anything spoken aloud. Later, alone in his study, he stood before the cold fireplace, the same place he had stood countless nights before. Yet tonight the stillness felt different, less absolute, less certain. And he found himself remembering things he had not allowed himself to remember. The sound of laughter that once filled these halls, the warmth that had once existed without effort, without question, and he pushed the thought away immediately, his jaw tightening, as if the memory itself was something unwelcome, something dangerous, because hope had no place here. It never had. And yet, as the hours passed and the house settled into its usual quiet, Nathaniel Crowhurst found that the silence no longer felt like control. It felt like something else entirely, something fragile, something waiting, and for the first time in years, he did not know whether he feared its return or needed it more than he was willing to admit. The following morning did not announce itself with warmth or renewal. It never did. But something within the house had shifted just enough that the silence no longer felt untouched, and Elena Hayes noticed it the moment she entered the east wing, not because anything had visibly changed, but because Lily was already awake, already sitting by the window with her doll resting loosely in her lap, her gaze not distant as before, but waiting, and that alone was enough to alter the rhythm of the room. Elena did not speak immediately, did not rush toward her. She simply moved to the chair she had claimed in quiet consistency and sat, allowing the stillness to settle around them without pressure, and for a time nothing happened, no words, no movement. Only the soft light filtering through the glass and the quiet presence of two people who no longer felt entirely separate, until Elena reached into her case once more and withdrew a small ribbon, faded but carefully kept. She did not explain it, did not offer it directly. She simply placed it on the table between them and returned her hands to her lap, as if the choice belonged entirely to the child, and Lily's eyes lowered to it, studying the simple object with a focus that had not existed before, her fingers tightening slightly around her doll before. Slowly, she leaned forward and touched the ribbon with hesitant curiosity, lifting it with both hands as though it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Elena watched without interruption, her expression unchanged, calm, patient, and after a moment Lily shifted closer, bringing the ribbon with her, her small movements deliberate but uncertain, until she stopped just within reach, and for a breath she hesitated, as if remembering something long forgotten, before extending the ribbon toward Elena, not as a gift, not quite, but as a question, and Elena accepted it gently, her fingers brushing lightly against the child's without pause. Then without comment she reached forward and tied the ribbon loosely around Lily's wrist, the motion slow, careful, as though it held more meaning than the object itself. and when she finished she did not withdraw immediately, her hand resting for a brief moment before returning to her side. And Lily did not pull away, did not retreat. She simply looked down at the ribbon now resting against her skin, her expression unreadable yet softer than before. Across the hall Nathaniel stood once again at a distance he told himself was unintentional. Though by now the pattern had become too consistent to ignore, he had not meant to come here, had not meant to observe, and yet he did, drawn by something he refused to name. And when he saw the small interaction unfold, something in his chest tightened again, not sharply, not painfully, but with a weight that lingered longer than he was willing to accept, because it was not the ribbon that mattered. It was the exchange, the quiet understanding that required no words, no explanation, something he had once known and lost without realizing it until now. His jaw tightened slightly as he stepped back, turning away before the moment could settle any deeper, but it followed him regardless. The image of his daughter no longer entirely unreachable, no longer entirely lost within herself, and the realization unsettled him more than anything else had. Because if she could return, even in the smallest of ways, then everything he had convinced himself was permanent might not be as certain as he believed, and that uncertainty was not something he knew how to face. The change did not arrive with noise or declaration. It unfolded quietly, almost carefully, as if the house itself was uncertain whether it should allow it. And over the next few days the rhythm of Blackwood Manor shifted in ways so subtle they could be ignored by anyone who did not wish to see them. But Nathaniel Crowhurst saw them, even when he told himself he did not, because he began to notice things that had long since disappeared. The faint sound of movement in the east wing that was not restless pacing, the soft murmur of a voice that no longer felt like an intrusion, and most unsettling of all, the absence of the heavy stillness that had once defined every corner of the house. It was not gone, not entirely, but it was no longer complete, and that alone was enough to unsettle him. One afternoon as gray light filtered through the tall windows, Elena sat once more with Lily, the book resting closed in her lap this time, her voice absent, allowing the silence to exist without filling it, and Lily sat beside her, closer than before, her small hand occasionally brushing against the ribbon still tied around her wrist, as if reminding herself it was real. And after a long stretch of quiet, Elena reached for a piece of paper and a pencil, placing them gently on the table between them, not offering, not instructing, simply leaving them there as a possibility. Lily's gaze lowered to the objects, lingering there as though uncertain what they meant, her fingers tightening slightly before slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and picked up the pencil. The movement small but deliberate, and Elena did not speak, did not guide. She simply remained, her presence steady, unchanged, and Lily lowered the pencil to the paper, her hand trembling just enough to show the effort it took, and then she made a mark, a single, uneven line, nothing more, yet it carried a weight that filled the room far more than words ever could. Elena's expression softened, though she said nothing, because the moment did not need acknowledgement to be understood, and Lily looked at the line as if it were something fragile, something important, her fingers hovering over it before tracing it lightly, as if confirming it existed. In the corridor beyond, Nathaniel stood once again where he had no intention of being, his presence silent, unseen, and yet drawn there all the same, his gaze fixed on the small scene before him, the paper, the pencil, the child who had not engaged with the world in years now creating something, however small, however imperfect, and something within him shifted again, deeper this time, more difficult to ignore, because it was no longer just presence, no longer just quiet moments. It was change, undeniable, irreversible, and he did not know whether to stop it or protect it, the uncertainty settling heavily in his chest as he turned away before the moment could unfold any further, his steps measured, controlled, yet lacking the certainty they once held, because for the first time in years, Nathaniel Crowhurst found himself facing something he had long refused to consider, not loss, not grief, but the fragile, dangerous possibility that what had been broken might not be beyond repair, and he did not yet know whether that possibility was something to fear or something he could no longer live without. By the time the next evening settled over Blackwood Manor, the change could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. not by the servants who moved with quieter steps and longer glances, and certainly not by Nathaniel Crowhurst, who now found himself pausing outside the east wing without pretense, without excuse, as though some part of him had already accepted what the rest still resisted. And inside the room the air felt different again, not lighter, not warmer, but alive in a way that did not belong to this place. Elena sat beside the small table where the paper still rested, now marked by more than a single line. Faint shapes drawn with uncertain hands, uneven and fragile, yet unmistakably intentional. And Lily sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, her small fingers curled around the pencil with growing familiarity, her movements still slow but no longer hesitant, as if the act itself had begun to anchor her to something beyond silence. Elena did not guide her, did not correct or praise. She simply remained, her presence constant, allowing the child to discover each moment without interruption. And after a while Lily paused, her eyes lifting from the page to meet Elena's, holding there for a brief second that stretched longer than it should have. And then, almost imperceptibly, her lips parted as if forming something, a thought, a word, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for far too long. But the sound did not come, not yet, and still Elena did not press, did not ask. She only nodded once, softly, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be spoken aloud. And in the doorway Nathaniel stood watching, no longer hidden by shadow, no longer retreating at the first sign of change, his presence quiet but unmistakable, and neither of them reacted to it as they once would have. Lily did not shrink away, did not turn her face. She simply glanced toward him before returning her attention to the paper, as though his presence was no longer something to fear, and that alone sent something unfamiliar through him, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable, because he had spent years believing he had lost her entirely, that whatever part of her had once reached for him was gone beyond return, and now he stood there watching her reach again, not toward him, not yet, but toward something, toward someone. And the realization settled heavily in his chest. "What is this?" he asked at last, his voice lower than usual, not demanding, not cold, but searching in a way he did not recognize. Elena turned her gaze toward him, calm as ever. "It is her choosing to stay," she said simply, and the words struck deeper than they should have, because he understood what she meant without needing it explained, understood that this was not about instruction or progress or expectation. It was about presence, about the quiet decision to remain when leaving would have been easier. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze shifting between them, between the small hand still gripping the pencil and the woman who had somehow stepped into a silence no one else had ever been able to reach. And something within him shifted again, not breaking, not yet, but softening in a way that felt both unfamiliar and dangerously close to something he had long denied himself. And as the candlelight flickered against the walls and the quiet of the room settled around them, Nathaniel Crowhurst remained where he was, no longer turning away, no longer pretending that nothing had changed, because for the first time in years, he was beginning to understand that what had returned to this house was not noise or disruption, but something far more unsettling, something that could not be controlled, and once allowed to exist, could not easily be undone. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, yet something beneath them had shifted beyond denial, and Nathaniel Crowhurst found that the distance he had once maintained with absolute certainty no longer held the same strength, because he no longer remained in the shadows by accident. He stood in the doorway openly now, his presence no longer hidden, no longer avoided, and still neither of them reacted as they once would have, which unsettled him more than defiance ever could. Inside the east wing the afternoon light stretched long across the floor, pale and quiet, and Elena sat beside Lily as she had every day since her arrival, the paper now filled with faint lines that had grown steadier, more certain, the pencil no longer held with hesitation but with a quiet determination that had not existed before, and Lily's small hand moved slowly across the page, her focus unwavering, as if each mark she made carried more meaning than the world she had once retreated from. Elena did not interrupt, did not guide. She simply remained, her presence a constant that did not demand but allowed. And after a moment Lily paused, her hand stilling, her gaze lifting once more, this time not toward Elena, but toward the figure standing at the door, and the moment stretched, fragile and uncertain, because this was different. This was not the quiet acceptance of his presence. This was something more deliberate, more aware. Nathaniel felt it immediately, the subtle shift. In her attention, the way her eyes did not retreat, did not avoid him as they had for years, and something within him tightened, not with fear, not with anger, but with something far more unfamiliar, anticipation. He did not move, did not step closer, as though any motion might break whatever fragile moment was unfolding. And Lily's fingers tightened slightly around the pencil before slowly, carefully, she placed it down on the table, the small sound of it touching the surface louder than it should have been in the quiet room, and then, with a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed, she turned her body just enough to face him, not fully, not completely, but enough that there was no mistaking it, and her lips parted once more, the same fragile motion from before, but this time it lingered longer, as if the word had moved closer to the surface, closer to something real. Nathaniel's breath stilled without his consent, his entire focus narrowing to that single moment, that single possibility, because for years he had convinced himself that silence was permanent, that what had been lost could not return, and now he stood on the edge of something he did not know how to face, something he did not know how to survive if it vanished again. Elena remained still, her gaze lowered, her presence quiet, offering no pressure, no expectation, only space. And in that space Lily's voice finally emerged, soft, fragile, but unmistakable. "Papa." The word barely more than a breath, yet it carried through the room with a weight that shattered. Years of silence in an instant, and Nathaniel Crowhurst did not move, did not speak, because for the first time in 5 years, he felt something break open inside him that he had believed was beyond repair, something he had buried beneath control and distance and silence. And now, standing there in the fading light, he realized with a certainty that left him unsteady, that whatever had begun in this house was no longer something he could ignore, no longer something he could send away, because the moment his daughter spoke that word, everything he had built to survive her silence had already begun to fall apart. The word did not fade when it was spoken. It remained in the air long after the sound itself had disappeared, fragile yet unyielding, and Nathaniel Crowhurst stood as though the ground beneath him had shifted into something unfamiliar, something unsteady, because for 5 years he had lived within a silence that had defined every breath, every step, every choice. And now that silence had been broken by a voice he had nearly forgotten how to hear, he did not move at first, did not trust himself. 2. His gaze fixed on the small figure before him, as though any sudden motion might shatter the moment into something unreal. Lily remained where she was, her expression uncertain now, as if she did not fully understand what she had done, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table as her eyes searched his face for something she could not name, and in that hesitation, something inside him gave way, not loudly, not completely, but enough that the distance he had held so carefully for years began to falter. He stepped forward then, slow, deliberate, as though approaching something fragile, something that required care rather than control, and each step felt heavier than it should have, weighted by everything that had come before, everything he had refused to feel. Elena did not move, did not speak, her presence still and unobtrusive, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. And when Nathaniel reached the edge of the room, he stopped, just close enough that there was no longer a barrier between them, yet not so close as to overwhelm. "What had only just begun, Lily," he said, her name unfamiliar on his own lips, softer than it had ever been. And for a moment the room held its breath again, the fragile thread between them stretching but not breaking. Lily's eyes widened slightly, her gaze steady as she watched him, and then, slowly, almost cautiously, she shifted her hand from the table, extending it just enough that the space between them no longer felt insurmountable, and that single movement carried more weight than anything else could have, because it was not forced, not guided, it was chosen, and Nathaniel saw it, understood it in a way that reached far deeper than words ever could. His own hand lifted almost without thought, the motion unfamiliar, uncertain, yet driven by something stronger than hesitation. And when his fingers finally brushed against hers, The contact was light, tentative, as though both of them were testing something long forgotten, and neither pulled away, neither retreated. They remained there, connected by the simplest of gestures, yet one that carried the weight of years of absence, years of silence. And something within Nathaniel shifted again, not breaking this time, but opening, allowing something through that he had long kept sealed away. Something fragile, something dangerous, something he had once known, but had convinced himself was gone forever. And as the quiet settled around them once more, no longer empty, but filled with something new, something uncertain, Nathaniel Crowhurst realized with a clarity that left him unsteady that the moment he had feared, the moment he had avoided for so long, had already arrived, and it was not the return of pain that threatened him, but the return of something far more powerful, something he was no longer certain he could live without. The moment did not end when their hands touched. It lingered, stretching quietly into something neither of them had prepared for, and Nathaniel Crowhurst felt it in the way his breath no longer came as easily, in the way his thoughts, once so controlled, now faltered under the weight of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to vulnerability, and he withdrew his hand not because he wished to, but because the feeling unsettled him more than any silence ever had, stepping back just enough to restore distance, to remind himself of the boundaries he had relied on for years. And yet the space between them no longer felt the same, because something had already crossed it, something that could not be undone. Lily watched him as he stepped away, her small fingers curling slightly, as if holding onto the memory of the contact, her expression uncertain, searching, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the fragile connection might slip, might retreat back into the quiet that had once defined her, and Nathaniel saw it, saw the hesitation forming, and something in him reacted before thought could intervene. "Stay," he said, the word leaving him low and steady, carrying more weight than he intended, and it stilled her immediately, her gaze lifting to meet his once more, the uncertainty softening just enough that the moment did not break. And in that instant, he understood something he had refused to accept until now, that this was not something he could approach and abandon at will, not something he could control and dismiss when it became uncomfortable, because it was not about him alone. It was about her, about the fragile trust that had begun to form in silence and could just as easily disappear if mishandled. And the realization settled heavily in his chest, grounding him in a way nothing else had for years. Elena remained where she was, her presence quiet, observing without interference. But there was a shift in her expression now, subtle but undeniable, as though she recognized the moment for what it truly was, not a breakthrough alone, but a turning point. And Nathaniel turned slightly toward her, his gaze sharper now, not with anger, but with something deeper, something closer to realization. "This was not meant to happen," he said, his voice low, controlled, yet lacking the certainty it once held, and Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "It was always meant to happen," she replied softly, and the words settled between them with quiet certainty. Because she did not speak of chance or coincidence, she spoke of something inevitable, something that had only needed time, and Nathaniel did not respond immediately, because part of him resisted that idea, resisted the thought that something beyond his control had been moving within his own house, within his own life, and yet another part of him, quieter but stronger, understood that what he had witnessed, what he had felt, could not be dismissed as anything else. He turned back toward Lily then, his attention no longer divided, no longer guarded in the same way, and though he did not step closer again, he did not retreat either. He remained present, and that alone was enough, because for the first time in years, Nathaniel Crowhurst was not standing apart from the silence. He was standing within something new, something fragile, something that required more than control, and as the quiet of the room settled around them once more, no longer empty, but filled with something steady and real, he realized with a clarity that left him unsteady that whatever this was, whatever it had become, he could no longer pretend he did not need it, and that truth was far more terrifying than anything he had faced before. The house did not return to what it had been, it could not, because something once awakened does not willingly retreat back into silence. And in the days that followed, Blackwood Manor carried a different kind of quiet, one that no longer suffocated but waited, as if every corridor, every shadowed corner, held the memory of what had begun, and refused to let it fade. Nathaniel Crowhurst no longer stood at a distance without reason, no longer convinced himself that what he witnessed did not matter, because each day made it harder to deny the truth he had resisted for so long. That presence, not force, had changed what he believed unchangeable, and it had not been his presence that had done it. It had been hers. Elena Hayes moved through the house with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the moment she arrived, never imposing, never demanding, yet never retreating, and the servants had begun to notice it as well. The way the East Wing no longer felt untouched, the way the child who had once been unreachable now lingered in spaces she had long abandoned, and most of all, the way their master no longer walked past those changes without pause. One late afternoon, as the sun cast a dim gold across the stone floors, Elena stood near the window while Lily sat beside her, the paper before her now filled with careful lines that no longer trembled. And when Nathaniel entered the room this time, he did not stop at the doorway. He stepped inside without hesitation, without the need to remain apart, and Lily looked up at him, not startled, not uncertain, simply aware, and after a brief moment she lifted her hand, not fully reaching, not fully retreating, but enough to show that the space between them no longer felt impossible, and Nathaniel crossed that space slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside her, close enough that he could see every small detail he had once avoided. And when he lowered his hand this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, his fingers closing gently around hers as if it were something natural, something that had always belonged there. And Lily did not pull away, did not retreat. She remained, her small hand resting within his with quiet acceptance. And for a moment neither of them moved, the silence around them no longer empty but full, steady, real. Elena watched from where she stood, her expression unchanged, her presence as quiet as it had always been. Yet there was something in the stillness of the moment that acknowledged what had been built without ever needing to claim it. Nathaniel's gaze lifted then, meeting hers across the room, and for the first time there was no resistance in it, no distance, only something unspoken yet unmistakable, understanding. And though he said nothing at first, the weight of what remained between them no longer needed words to exist. "You stayed," he said finally, his voice lower than before, quieter, as though the truth of it required no emphasis, and Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "So did you," she replied, and the simplicity of it settled deeper than anything else could have, because it was not about arrival or change alone. It was about the choice to remain when leaving would have been easier. And as the light faded slowly beyond the windows and the house settled into its new quiet, Nathaniel Crowhurst understood something he had spent years refusing to see, that healing did not come with force or certainty. It came in moments so small they could be overlooked, in presence that asked for nothing yet gave everything, and in the quiet refusal to leave when silence made it easier to walk away. And as he stood there, his daughter's hand in his, the woman who had brought that moment into existence, standing just beyond him, he realized that what he had believed beyond saving had never truly been lost. It had only been waiting for someone who would not turn away from it. And in that realization, something within him finally, quietly, began to live again.